Our next speaker is Jessica Spreitzer. She's a U.S. Meat Export Federation's Director of Trade Analysis. She has been with USMEF since 2014, and she works with a wide variety of databases and information sources to provide market analysis on the U.S. red meat industry and global trade to both international and domestic stakeholders. She also contributes to USMEF's red meat export forecast and reports. Jessica joined the company or the Federation in 2014 after receiving her MA in International Development with a focus on food security from University of Denver. She holds a BSM in Business Management and International Development from Tulane University. So let's welcome our speaker.
Where are my slides?
Here, one more, right? What is yours?
This one.
There you go.
Perfect. Thank you. And I have quite a few topics we're going to cover today. We're going to hit the high points for the world, for the global exporters and importers, and then end more specifically on the U.S. export situation. But to the loin question earlier, we are going to talk a little bit about how we're seeing significantly larger exports of pork loins now that we've seen some more saturation in the domestic market. So just to introduce the U.S. Meat Export Federation very briefly, we are the nonprofit trade association for beef, pork, and lamb exports, so for your red meat exports. And so we are represented by our members that include pork producers, beef producers, lamb producers, also our allied industries, so corn and soybeans, and agribusiness, also packers and the purveyors and traders. So we go all the way from the production side to the packer side. And we are a marketing organization, so we don't do any lobbying, but we work closely with MPPC. And really, where my kind of strength of the presentation is going to come from today is for the boots on the ground that we have around the world that are marketing your products every day. So these are the locations of our international offices. Our largest offices would be in Mexico, Japan, and Korea, where we also see our largest exports of red meat products. But we've had a lot of growth recently in Southeast Asia and also Latin America, which we're going to touch on a bit as well. So we have fantastic staff in these offices, and they are super passionate about U.S. pork, and I'm going to try and weave in some of their insights here to my slides. And before I get started, I should say, please feel free to interrupt me. I will have time for questions at the end, but if you see something on a particular slide, I don't mind at all if you want to interrupt and discuss further. So we have quite a few trends that, things have been, never a dull moment in the last few years for us in the international trade space. So we have moved past kind of the huge shift that we've seen from African swine fever on the global marketplace a few years ago, but we still do see the fallout from that on EU production and on the shifts in global trade. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. The U.S. is just now surpassing the EU as the largest exporter, but we are now seeing more competition from Brazil. So we'll talk about that a little more as well. And then on the U.S. side, we've seen this growth in market share in Asia and in Australia and New Zealand, and we're also seeing just overall record volumes to parts of Latin America. That has driven us to a value record on exports, and we're also looking to potentially see a volume record again over the next year or two, back past that high in 2020 and 2021 when we had that surge to China. And as we look ahead, U.S. exports are now accounting for over 30% of U.S. pork and variety meat production, which is a new high, and forecasts are for that to continue to see a larger share there. So to set the stage, really, of course, we can't have a global pork presentation without talking about China. And so on these charts, you can really see how massive that shift was in China's production after the finding of African swine fever. And so again, I know that we have been talked about this for years, but the point I want to make here on the importer side is that China's pork production fully rebounded very quickly. I remember people were thinking it would take a long time, and our China office was saying, like, China can do anything. Do not expect it to take more than 5 years. And they did. They've had a full rebound in pork production. 2023 pork production in China was essentially record high, down just from 2014. So we do not have the shortage of supplies on the China side. Production is lower right now this year as supplies are adjusting again, but we'll talk about that. Nothing near to the scale that we've seen in recent years. Vietnam has also fully rebounded from African swine fever. Philippines, on the other hand, is still significantly impacted. Dominican Republic still significantly impacted. But China being the big driver on the pork importer side, you can see that we've seen that full rebalancing of supplies. And on the exporter side, we've seen growth in production continuing from Brazil in recent years. The U.S. rebounded last year, and we're continuing to see growth this year. And at the same time as we were rebounding, the EU is having significant declines. So we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next few slides. So in 2023, EU production, which is the dark blue line here, and exports are the green line on the chart. EU production declined significantly from 2021 to 2023. So that was a 6.5 billion pound decline over those 2 years. So if we think about US pork production at roughly 24 billion pounds, they saw a decrease of a quarter of US total production in just 2 years. So that is a huge shift. And with that, that brought their exports down significantly as well. And so we had production declining about 12% over that time period, whereas exports dropped by closer to a third. So again, this is significant. Much of that shift was because of China. So about the amount that EU production declined was about the amount that China's imports declined. So again, that balancing there. But we are still seeing growth for markets outside of China. So the EU is trying to fill in more product to other markets as their domestic market was fairly weak during this time. And along with the loss of the China demand for EU exporters, and then the fairly weak demand within the EU, they were also challenged by high production costs, as all producers have been. But they had the additional challenge of importing feed in some of the major producing countries. And of course, that was affected by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, increasing prices for some of those imported feed costs as well. And regulation continues to really weigh on producers there. Many new regulations, uncertainty around new regulations and how they will be enforced. And that's also affecting some of the generational shifts. So it's just getting easier for some producers to leave without younger producers taking their place. And so with that, we saw a decrease in production for all member states in the EU except for Bulgaria. So production decreased from 2021 to 2023 for all of the major producers. Some of these producers, of course, are impacted by ASF, so Germany being the standout there. That was the pink bar at the top of the chart. They were historically always the largest producer in the EU, and Spain has recently surpassed them. So when Germany had the ASF finding, that impacted their export access, which then significantly impacted their profitability. So that's what's leading to that decrease there. Spain even decreased. Spain had been the growth engine, but Spain was struggling with PRRS last year. Spain has increased their breeding herd again as of the latest data, so we expect them, to continue to be a formidable competitor. They have worked significantly on their marketing in many markets, and of course using the Iberico image and kind of applying that for their all products. So getting that kind of benefit for that, the marketing image that carries. And so as we look ahead with that, just to put into context, this is from USDA for the US on the green chart, and the EU chart is in red, and that is from their government, so from the European Commission. Their long-term forecast is for an industry in decline. So their government has been regulating against red meat production, They're okay with poultry production, but they are not encouraging or even trying to make it possible to continue in this regulatory environment in the EU. So their own government is forecasting this long-term decline. The US, on the USDA side, we see longer-term growth in the industry. And so while we've seen this huge shift for the EU, you can kind of notice on this chart that we see the stabilization now. Forecasts are different. So USDA's forecast was for EU production to actually increase this year, so to stabilize at that lower level and to increase by 2%. The EU Commission's is for a slight decrease this year of just 0.4% for EU production. But again, across the board, kind of expecting this stabilization at this lower level, and according to their government, this long-term decline in production. And so where that, oh yes, go ahead.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Will these levels in Europe then keep them just with their domestic? Like, does that take away their exports, but they're still wanting, the government saying, still raise enough for us, but you don't need to export, or where does this put them?
Yes, so in some of the government's reports, they're definitely saying we do not need to be the agricultural exporter of the world. That is part of some of the red meat products, is we do not need to be providing that. But their exports are still important for pork, especially because, as we'll talk about on our US side, it helps with like the carcass maximization. So for the products they're eating, shipping some more of those like popular Asian products, like they ship more on the bellies and ribs to Asia, and that helps with their profitability to operate. And so exports will continue to be important. One of the big market kind of issues is that the UK is by far their biggest export market, because that's now not part of the EU, so that's considered an export, and that market has been weak for them too. But the industry is very focused, especially on Asia, and like Germany is still, they have to maintain exports if they're gonna keep up any production. So they lost a lot of export access with ASF, and they were still trying to push to some of the African markets, to Chile and South America, as they allowed exports from Germany. So they will continue to need exports just from that profitability basis. And Spain will continue to be competitive, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And so that brings us to the US surpassing the EU for the first time, so as the largest exporter. So this chart is excluding variety meats. If we include variety meats, the EU is still higher based on some of their variety meat exports to China. But looking just at pork muscle cuts for year-to-date data, the US is now a larger exporter than the EU. And the other trend you can kind of see on here is the green bar, Brazil catching up to Canada, and Brazil continues to grow production and exports, which we will talk about. So Brazil has really increased the share of production that they're exporting. So 10 years ago, they were exporting about 17% of their production. Now they export over 30%, so similar to the percentage that we're exporting of our production now in the US. And over the last 10 years, Brazil has also increased their pork production by 1/3. So historically, they've been kind of limited on their pork market access because of their FMD status. So with that, because they were FMD free only with vaccination, they were limited on the production areas of the country that could export to certain markets. So Japan and Korea are two of those notably. And they have increased production in those regions. That now accounts for about 3/4 of their total production. They've gotten more plants approved to some countries, including the Philippines recently. And as you can see, exports have been surging, and that is without China. So China and Hong Kong are the dark blue and light blue bars towards the bottom of the chart. And so those volumes have been lower for Brazil, and they have been sending record volumes essentially to almost all other markets. So Brazil is by far the low price competitor in our pork markets, much lower. Their prices, their export values are much lower than all other competitors that we are up against in the markets, lower than Canada as well. And so we've been seeing this really strong increase, and some of the biggest markets where we would also be competing would be Philippines, where Brazil has really ramped up their exports, and also in some of the markets in South America, so notably in Chile as well. And where Brazil has recently gained access is in some of our kind of mainstay US markets, so Mexico is a recent market access gain for them. Dominican Republic, which was typically 100% nearly U.S. pork, and also in Peru. So the most traction that they've gotten is in Peru. So they had no very small volumes last year. They just gained access to Peru last year with one plant approved, and they are now the largest supplier to Peru for pork. So again, they have the logistical advantage there. Similar in Chile, they can truck product to the market in 5 days. So they have that logistical advantage. But in the Dominican Republic, they have increased exports significantly. It's still a pretty small market share. And in Mexico, they have ramped up volumes, but it's still a small share. And the U.S. has continued to increase our exports to Mexico, even with Brazil still in the Mexican market. So more of a concern as they're expanding access to more markets. Colombia remains our kind of lone main market where Brazil does not have access. So Brazil is going to apply for FMD-free status without vaccination later this year, and that could also improve their market access as early as next year. And just to give a picture, again, in comparison, so where we are year to date, you can see we've talked about the EU, US, and Brazil. Brazil is still a more minor share compared to the US and the EU, so about a little less than 40% of what the EU and the US are exporting. And again, we're going to talk about China just a little bit, but this shift in exports has really been as the exporters have seen growth outside of China and Hong Kong. So you can see in the table the share of total exports that go to the China and Hong Kong market for each of these major suppliers. Brazil's share 2 years ago was 60%. Now it's 30%. The EU share was close to 50%. So we saw all that product need to find a new home in other markets, which ramped up competition significantly in 2022 as basically Brazil and EU pushed all that product into other Asian markets at lower prices. And at that time, the US domestic market was really strong still in 2022. So we kept more product domestically with our higher prices. And now that things have been shifting, we've seen the US regaining market shares, we'll talk about specifically in Korea, now that the EU is less competitive again. And so as we look at our major importers now, so this would be the top importing markets, again, you can see China on the chart, that huge decrease from where we were in 2020 and 2021. But exports are up across most of the other major markets, except for Japan, which continues to struggle with the weak yen, has been a major challenge there, and Canada. And again, I just want to point out the importance here. We'll talk about Mexico later. Mexico is now the second largest pork importer in the world, and that is because of the US. That is mostly US pork. Japan remains extremely important, the third largest importer. The Philippines has seen significant growth, since you can see the dark blue and light blue bars for the Philippines were 2019 and 2020 before they had the huge ASF decrease. And since then, they have lowered their tariffs. They still have very high tariffs in a kind of a weird and restrictive quota system. So most product goes out of quota, but it is now lower than before, where it was 40% and prohibitive for all suppliers. So the growth in the Philippines, and also South Korea, which we'll talk about. So I only have 2 slides on China, and then I promise we'll talk about other markets. So China, again, just to hit on this point, so China's production, you can see on the light blue bar, production was essentially record large last year. And with the import levels, supplies per person were at record levels. So hog prices were very weak as domestic consumption remained pretty sluggish. And as we've moved ahead through 2024, we see consumer confidence really remaining weak with a lot of the economic struggles. And production has adjusted lower. So last year, with the weaker hog prices, we did see some adjustment on the herd size. And that has been reflected with January to June production levels that were down 1.7% from last year. The hog prices also increased a bit to the highest levels that we've seen since early 2023. So as we look ahead from the latest data from our office in China, we do expect to see lower supplies compared to last year through the rest of this year. They are having heavier hog weights that are offsetting some of the decrease in slaughter, but we do expect to see lower production this year. But again, as you can kind of see on the slide with where hog prices are, that does not indicate any type of shortage. So that is more of a rebalancing at the moment in the market and rebalancing to meet some of that demand. So again, imports are just accounting for a very small, actually I'll turn the slide so we can see it. Imports have adjusted significantly lower and are accounting for a very small share of consumption, so like back to 3%. So there is that expectation that we will see lower supplies compared to last year, but with demand where it is, that's nothing to get too excited about at the moment. And looking ahead to 2025, there are indications we might actually see a bit of a rebound in production again, at least the latest data that we had from our office last week. So that can always change, but for right now, no expected big surprises from China later this year. And you'll see, again, on the chart showing just pork muscle cuts have weakened to even lower than where we were before ASF. And the U.S. has a very minor market share for pork muscle cuts because we still have retaliatory tariffs in place from the trade war with China. So we still pay a tariff on pork. That never went away. And so we are still paying higher tariff there. And on the variety meat side, that is where demand has sustained more. China is by far the top market for U.S. pork variety meats, and that remains extremely important. Pork feet, pork stomachs are some of the top items, and those do add significant value to the carcass, which I'll show a little later. So going on to Korea. So Korea is one of our big success stories. Korea is a market where we have a free trade agreement. And since 2010, Korea's pork consumption has increased 40%. They have record domestic production even since the beginning of the free trade agreement. So liberalizing their imports did not damage their domestic production. And as you can see on the chart, they've seen growth from imports as well. So they've seen growth from both the domestic and import side. And the growth this year, we've seen a really strong rebound, as I've talked about for the U.S., and Korea has been one of the big drivers of that. So U.S. exports to Korea are up nearly 50% so far this year. And as you can see on the chart, I'm sorry if it's a little hard to read, but essentially the EU suppliers are larger volumes from the U.S., Canada, and Chile. But you'll also note Germany is on there. I wonder if this has a pointer. Germany is here. Oh, uh-oh. And Germany was out of the market because of the finding of ASF, and they now have a brand new regionalization agreement. So this is kind of one of the first examples of how that would work in a major importing market like Korea. So they are back in the market now with that regionalization agreement for ASF. So this is a picture from Korea. I was in our Korea office earlier this year, actually, and they are by far the leader in convenience. This is something we talked about for Korea before COVID. So even before COVID, you could get your 15, right? Yeah. 250? 250, okay. I'll do less than 10 for questions. I have a lot of slots left. So you could get delivery overnight before COVID. You can get delivery now in a half hour, depending on where you live and what time you place the order. This has been huge for pork. As you've seen, pork consumption increase 40%, as I showed. This really plays into the convenience factor as well. The availability of these high quality meals, home meal replacements, restaurant meal replacements, using high quality protein that are very affordably priced. So you can get a meal like this for like $8 US, sometimes less, and it's very high quality. So for your lunch takeaway, for dinner, in Korea, single households make up over a third of the population. In the US, we're at closer to a quarter, and in Mexico, it's 13%. So obviously, marketing strategies are different depending on where you are. And convenience is a huge factor in Korea. So this is an activity that our Korea office did on the pork loin. I'll just briefly touch on, but we work all the way from the importer to distributor side on education. So for this one, we were working with exporters and knowing we need to push on the pork loin more. And so what can we do to get distributors to use this product? Loin is not a product we usually would ever export to Korea because they have large domestic production, and typically all of their main dishes that are made with loin would be from domestic production. So it wasn't an item we typically compete on. We usually supply more on the butt and picnic side for our larger frozen exports. And so with that meeting, working with the distributors and importers, we developed hopefully I didn't mess this up now. Oop. Some different products, and this product is from Ashley, a restaurant chain. They are now selling this crispy pork cutlet made with U.S. pork loin on e-commerce and on their special store. And so this, let's see if I can get it to play. Here we go. So they played this ad in elevators, in apartment buildings, just a very short clip. And again, I always say, why can't we get this in the US? To the loin question, I would love a crispy pork loin with cheese that I could just make in the microwave. It looks delicious. So this is kind of the marketing that we do in market. So on the ASEAN side, I'll just be very brief here, but this is another region where we've seen a lot of disruptions from ASF. So Philippines production is down like 35% still from where they were in 2019. Vietnam has rebounded more from their ASF struggles, but they've seen a huge influx of Russian pork. That is a big market for Russia's exports now. And Malaysia is a new and really quickly growing market for the U.S., which is somewhat unusual since that is a Muslim country, but there is a large share of Chinese population in Malaysia, and they were hit extremely hard by ASF. Like 70% of the farms that were affected just exited. And so they have a significant shortage and have been really ramping up imports. And so the pictures on this slide here are from a promotion that we did at a retailer in Malaysia that included processed products, which are really popular there, Johnsonville, Hormel, but also spare ribs, pork shoulder, and pork loin even for a retail promotion. So another reason that we expect to see growth in this region is because of an increase in income. So as we look around the world, it's kind of hard to find middle-class households that add up to the size of like a Japan market, for example. So Japan has 40 million households with a disposable income of over 25,000. The only places, higher than that, when you look at the EU, China, the US, we just don't have those kind of numbers elsewhere. So in Southeast Asia, there's expected to be really strong growth in that middle income household number. And those Southeast Asian nations combined would add up to an additional 8 million households in the next 5 years. So we're gonna have to increase consumption as we see population growth kind of slowing around the world. So we're gonna have to grow consumption versus just adding more people eating more. We need to get everyone to eat more pork. And some of the ways that we see that opportunity is where we see these growing incomes. So now switching gears to Latin America. Latin America has been a huge growth driver for the US pork industry, notably Mexico, as you can see in the green there. But we have basically doubled the volumes that we've sent in the last 11 years since I was doing this back to 2012 when we had the start of some free trade agreements. So Latin America now takes 50% of US pork exports. A huge factor here is our free trade agreement, so we cannot stress enough the importance of those. We have a free trade agreement with Mexico, with in South America, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, and then with all the Central American countries, plus the Dominican Republic. So that has been key to this growth here. Mexico has been the massive driver for pork export growth for the US last year and into this year. They are really struggling with drought. On the pork production side, they're also struggling with PRRS and PEDV, and they have been for at least the last few years, and especially last year too. And so we see this need for more protein, and the U.S. is the top supplier across the board. So they have been importing more pork, more poultry, and more beef. Their beef consumption remains pretty low because of the high prices, but pork has really been surging because of its affordability, and of course, it's important with the cuisine and the food and the fit there, with pork being utilized for tacos and many other applications. So we've seen further growth as they're shorter on their domestic supplies, as HPAI has also impacted on the poultry and egg side for domestic production. And now we have the Newcastle announcement last week, the finding in Brazil, which has cut off their exports to Mexico for now. For our office, they're expecting it to be somewhat short-lived according to what they're hearing in the Mexican market, but again, that is significant as well, that there will be no Brazilian poultry available for export to Mexico. So at least in the short term, that's significant. Mexico's pork consumption is basically similar to what I showed you for Korea. So another success story where we have 40% growth in consumption, basically, going back to 2010. And here you can see on the chart, the green is the US. So green, the US bar there is what has been allowing more consumers in Mexico to eat more pork, is growth from the US. So the US accounts for about half of all pork eaten in Mexico now. And I have a video I'm going to show on the next slide. I'm not going to show the whole thing for the interest of time, but I'll just show a little bit of it because I just want to give an idea. In our Mexico office, we're working heavily on the distributor side, on the processor side, but we also do have activities all the way down to the consumer, as this is a market where U.S. products are really clearly recognized and kind of entrenched in the market. So I'll just show a little bit of the focus that we do here. So they will actually do this kind of education and sampling for importers who invite their food service or retailer clients that want to learn about these applications. And they'll also do this kind of sampling and education at retail stores that request it and offer that for consumers. And we also focus on new product development as well and working closely with the importers in Mexico. So this is just an example of 2 new products that were developed last year with U.S. pork loin. One is a smoked pork loin product, which is one of the most popular processed pork items sold in Mexico. And the other one is a pork loin, like chopped already for tacos product that has been selling really well. And these are already at Walmart and City Club, which is another big retailer. And just last month, we had a big kind of symposium in Mexico where buyers met sellers and more retailers were interested in this product as well. Okay. Lastly, on the markets here, Central America continues to really grow as well in addition to Mexico. The U.S. supplies a huge share of consumption in some of these markets. So over 80% of the pork eaten in Honduras is U.S. pork, over 70% in the Dominican Republic now after ASF. And I actually think it's higher because I think the numbers out of the DR are lower than it shows on production. 70% in El Salvador, nearly 40% in Guatemala. So this is an opportunity where we continue to see potential for growth. Consumption remains low in these markets, and there's the potential to grow this further. And the supplies are going to come from the U.S. That's where we dominate market share in these markets. And so on that point, I should have included the U.S. on this slide, but the U.S. would be kind of like right around here for our consumption. There are these markets, Taiwan, China, Korea, that are major producers and also importers that have a very, pork is entrenched in their markets and is already highly consumed. But there are many markets where we have the potential to grow consumption significantly. And that is going to become more and more important as we see a slowdown in population growth around the world. All right, so my last topic here is just on what this means for U.S. pork exports. U.S. pork exports were record in value last year, so we've seen exports increase by 35% over the last 10 years. Domestic production only increased by 18% during that time. So with that, we are exporting this record large share of pork and variety meat production at nearly 31% of production being exported so far this year. So if we look at what we export and we divide that by the population in the U.S., that's 6.9 pounds per person. So almost 7 pounds per person of pork more would have to be eaten every year without exports. And our domestic consumption is 21.6 pounds, and that's been pretty flat for recent history. I mean, even like the last 2 decades, pretty flat. So all that growth has been pushed to the export market. And again, that's why it will be important for us to increase consumption in markets around the world. And And as I kind of alluded to before, we're exporting larger shares of the picnic and the ham primal. So we estimate that almost 50% of picnics and hams in the US are exported. That is largely because of Mexico, especially on the ham side there. So again, think about how many fewer hogs we need here in Iowa if we're not sending half of our hams and picnics to international markets. So again, the importance of preserving our international markets as well, especially Mexico. And more of the middle of the animal stays in the US. Those are our favorite things to eat here. But the loin percentage exported was 10% about 5 years ago. So we've seen a huge increase in shift in sending more of the loin abroad. And again, with some of the challenges around, generational changes in eating in the US, we continue to see more of that push to develop markets for loins internationally. Variety meats also add value. Feet, I mentioned, and stomachs for China. So all of our variety meat exports together add $11 per head. So again, this is an important piece of it. Those are primarily to China and Mexico, and then the Philippines is our third largest market. So looking at how that breaks down per head, so far this year, export value divided by all hogs slaughtered in the US, so not just the hogs where we saw some of that meat exported, all hogs slaughtered in the US, was over $66 per head. Nearly 19 of that is coming from Mexico. Then 11 from Japan, our next largest export market by value, 8 to China, 6 Canada, 7 Korea. So again, the importance there of our export markets, and also the growth and the importance of some of our other markets, so like Central America and Southeast Asia that are going into that others bucket. And so year to date, US exports are up 7% from last year on a value basis. The exports to Mexico are already over $1 billion. So we continue to see strength across the board. Exports are only lower really to China, Hong Kong, and then also we've had somewhat of a slowdown in the Caribbean and Dominican Republic as we've seen a bit more of those Brazilian volumes there. So lastly, we are on pace for record value this year, $8.4 billion. We continue to see modest growth forecasts into next year as well. There could be more upside to this if Mexico holds on as strong as it has been. So we're penciling in about a 4.5% increase in exports on a volume basis this year and a 3% increase on value. And with that, I'd like to take any questions. I have one closing slide, but I'm not going to talk about it for time, so we'll go to questions instead, and then if these are shared, you can see my final points there.
The China tariff thing, would that, if that tariff were decreased or eliminated, where would that put us in the China game?
So that, when it went into place, we saw all of the other suppliers basically bring their prices up, but just under the US with the tariff. So they all got more money basically because US prices were higher. If it came off, it would definitely help even out the competition level. But again, there's still, some challenges around the China market with consumption right now. But we had larger market share before the tariff. So it helps us when we can be on a level playing field competing. We've seen that in other markets as well, where we get a fair shot at competing.
Are we the only country with any tariffs, or are they different?
There are tariffs. So there are, the most favored nation tariff across the board is 12%. There are countries that have free trade agreements, but on pork, people are paying 12%, but then ours has an additional 25%. It had an additional on top of the extra 25 that has been waived right now, but we still have the additional 25, which is significant.
One slide, you had the consumption at 20-something. Is that kilograms or pounds?
Oh, that's kilograms, sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I do things in kilograms and metric tons. I know it's annoying, so. Yes. Yes, this is kilograms. Oh, I cited it on this one. Yes. This is in, no, this is pounds. So the reason that's different is because this is in product weight. So to compare exports and consumption. So like all the data that we do for exports is in product weight, not in carcass weight. So it's lower than carcass weight.
Well, I don't understand that at all.
So
Our consumption
So,
It's 51 pounds.
yes,
Okay, and so what does
yes.
this represent?
So this should be US, this is only from US, like pork without exports and without imports. So if you have US pork consumption plus exports and imports, plus imports minus exports, that would give you the 50 pounds. But this is even less because it's in product weight, not carcass weight. So that makes it about 70% of what product weight would be. And then it's also lower because it doesn't include the 6.9 pounds that are going to export. So it's only the pork that stays there. So I'm comparing those two, if that makes sense. But this is in product weight, not carcass weight. So in the WASD, you would see like the carcass weight number, that's the 50.2 pounds of consumption. I can send it to you too if that would be helpful to see the math on it. I'm sorry, I know we always do product weight, which is confusing for most everyone, but those doing trade data.
Another question, Brazil is exporting into eastern Mexico. Is that?
Yes.
That's fresh product too, right?
Yeah, so they have to do frozen. It's been frozen. They may have tested some fresh, but we're hearing it's frozen. So obviously all our product mostly is going combos fresh. And so the one like difference was that, you know, they may not be able to compete on the frozen side. However, once people test product, it always gains a bit of a foothold. And some of those same processors are using Brazilian poultry. It's frozen, obviously. So they do have the processing in place to handle some of that frozen Brazilian pork, but it's mostly going to be frozen, what we're seeing from Brazil and Mexico.
And the reason it's frozen, it takes so long to
Yes,
get to the coast before
yes,
it's shipped, right?
yes, yes. So it's a significantly longer transit time, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is that 21.6, is that fresh product?
Yes, yeah. So this 21.6, and I can are we going to send these out? I can send it clarified on the chart with more detail, and I can convert it to carcass weight actually, so it's less confusing. But yes, most of obviously our fresh pork consumption is lower in the U.S., and we have a very high share of processed pork consumption.
I have a question. Does Brazil have to deal with some of these tariffs with countries like we do? Is that a competitive advantage for them globally?
So in Mexico, well, generally where we would have free trade agreements could be a difference. So typically they can be competitive, sometimes even with a tariff. So in the Dominican Republic, they have to pay, oh, I should check. I think it's 25. It's 20 or 25. They are competitive with a 25 tariff against the US. That's how cheap it is in comparison. Mexico, they will have a 20% tariff, but it's being waived right now. So the Mexican government waived tariffs on all other suppliers just temporarily because of inflation. So that has helped them in Mexico. In Asia, depending on the market, we have an advantage because we have trade agreements. But again, they're still competitive in some places, even with tariffs. I think I'm over my time, yes.
Yeah, but can you make a comment about the fresh pork exports against the frozen pork?
Yes, so fresh pork exports and frozen pork. Fresh pork is primarily to Mexico, largely to Mexico. And our other largest fresh pork markets, like in Asia, would be Japan. We are growing in Korea. Oh, Canada, I should have said Canada. Mexico, then Canada. Japan, we are growing in Korea, but it's still small, but that is developing, and that's a big opportunity. We're starting to see a little bit in Latin America. So Colombia is trying to develop it, some in Central America, but most of the fresh product would go Mexico, Canada. That's a little, it's not quite 50-50, but it's close to a 50-50 split on chilled versus frozen that's exported. And we are the largest chilled exporter in the world, and that is a big advantage for us that I should have mentioned. So we have that chilled advantage to Asia. US and Canada are the ones sending chilled pork to Asia.